The climate connection. Environmental crisis fueling human bondage. Environmental destruction has become the most powerful force driving slavery expansion across Mauritania, creating conditions where human bondage appears necessary for survival rather than morally reprehensible exploitation. The Sahara Desert has expanded westward by approximately 12,000 square kilometers since 2020, swallowing agricultural land and forcing entire communities into situations where slavery becomes their only means of survival. Rainfall patterns that once supported traditional pastoral lifestyles have shifted dramatically, with some regions experiencing 40% less precipitation than historical averages. These environmental changes have created a direct pipeline from climate disaster to human bondage, as desperate families surrender their children to slave-owning households in exchange for basic necessities like food and water. Climate refugees fleeing environmental disasters arrive in towns and cities with nothing but the clothes on their backs, making them perfect targets for slave owners seeking fresh labor. When prolonged droughts destroy livestock herds and kill crops, entire families become homeless and dependent on others for survival. These displaced people accept any arrangement that promises shelter and food, even when those arrangements involve unpaid labor and permanent servitude. Traditional social safety nets that might have protected vulnerable families during previous environmental crises have collapsed under the weight of repeated disasters affecting larger populations simultaneously. Water scarcity has transformed enslaved labor from a convenience into an absolute necessity for livestock owners and agricultural operators throughout rural Mauritania. Wells that once provided adequate water for small communities now require constant maintenance and expansion to reach deeper groundwater sources. Enslaved workers perform this dangerous well-digging work without safety equipment, while their masters profit from selling water to neighboring communities. The economic value of water access has increased so dramatically that slave owners view their human property as essential infrastructure rather than expendable labor. Livestock care has become exponentially more labor-intensive as animals require constant movement between increasingly scarce water sources and grazing areas. Enslaved herders now walk much longer distances to find adequate pasture and must work around the clock to keep animals alive during extended dry periods. Masters who once allowed enslaved herders some autonomy now monitor their movements closely because losing animals to drought represents catastrophic financial losses. The increased difficulty of livestock management has made skilled enslaved herders more valuable to their owners, strengthening the bonds of slavery rather than creating opportunities for freedom. Traditional nomadic routes that sustained pastoral communities for centuries have become impassable due to persistent drought conditions and expanding desert terrain. Nomadic families who once moved freely across vast territories now find themselves trapped in small areas around permanent water sources controlled by sedentary populations. These trapped nomads become dependent on established communities for survival and often surrender family members into slavery arrangements to secure access to water and grazing rights. The collapse of traditional mobility patterns has eliminated the economic independence that once allowed nomadic groups to resist enslavement. International climate adaptation funding totaling over $60 million has reached Mauritania since 2020, yet none of this money has been specifically allocated to address slavery vulnerabilities created by environmental disasters. Climate adaptation projects focus on infrastructure development and agricultural modernization, without considering how these improvements might benefit slave owners more than enslaved populations. Water infrastructure projects funded by international donors often strengthen the economic position of slave-owning families who control the land where new wells and irrigation systems are installed. Environmental degradation has concentrated vulnerable populations in regions where slavery traditions are strongest and most resistant to outside intervention. Families fleeing drought-stricken areas typically migrate to the southeastern regions of Mauritania, where slavery is most entrenched among traditional pastoral communities. This geographic concentration makes it easier for slave owners to acquire new enslaved people, while making it more difficult for activists and international observers to monitor slavery conditions across dispersed populations. Agricultural slavery has intensified as climate change has reduced the total amount of arable land, while increasing the labor required to maintain crop production on remaining fertile areas. Enslaved agricultural workers now spend more time hauling water from distant sources and maintaining irrigation systems that require constant repair due to harsh environmental conditions. The decreased reliability of rainfall has made agricultural planning more complex and labor-intensive, requiring enslaved workers to adapt their activities based on unpredictable weather patterns. Climate scientists predict that environmental conditions in Mauritania will continue deteriorating throughout the next decade as global temperatures rise and precipitation patterns become even more erratic. These predictions suggest that current trends linking environmental degradation to slavery expansion will accelerate rather than stabilize. Water scarcity is expected to worsen significantly as underground aquifers become depleted and surface water sources disappear entirely in many regions. Climate justice advocates have begun recognizing connections between environmental protection and human rights that could transform approaches to addressing slavery in environmentally vulnerable regions. However, these connections remain largely theoretical because climate funding and anti-slavery advocacy continue operating through separate institutional channels that rarely coordinate their activities. Addressing climate change could provide the most effective pathway to reducing slavery in Mauritania, because environmental stability would eliminate many of the desperation factors that drive families into bondage arrangements. Yet despite this understanding, the fundamental obstacles preventing meaningful progress remain as entrenched as ever. The unbroken chain. Why slavery persists in 2025. The roots of this persistence run deeper than policy failures or international neglect, extending into fundamental structures that have remained unchanged for centuries. 5 years of international scrutiny, diplomatic pressure, and advocacy campaigns have produced virtually no meaningful change in Mauritania's slavery crisis because the fundamental structures that make human bondage profitable and socially acceptable remain completely intact. The government has mastered the art of performative reform by establishing agencies, passing laws, and making public statements that create an illusion of progress while ensuring that actual slavery practices continue undisturbed. International observers have been consistently fooled by this theatrical approach because they mistake bureaucratic activity for substantive policy implementation. The result is a system where slavery has actually expanded during the same period when international attention reached its highest levels. International pressure has failed spectacularly because major powers consistently prioritize strategic interests over human rights when these concerns conflict with economic or security objectives. The United States values Mauritania as a counter-terrorism partner in the Sahel region and provides military cooperation that strengthens the same government that refuses to prosecute slave owners. European nations depend on Mauritanian cooperation for migration control and potential energy partnerships that override human rights concerns in policy discussions. China's massive infrastructure investments create economic dependencies that reduce pressure for human rights improvements while potentially expanding opportunities for enslaved labor exploitation. These strategic calculations ensure that international criticism remains purely rhetorical rather than translating into meaningful consequences for the Mauritanian government. Deep structural factors rooted in centuries of social hierarchy make slavery extraordinarily resistant to reform efforts because the practice serves essential economic and cultural functions for dominant groups. The Badain Arab Berber elite built their wealth and social status on enslaved labor and view any challenge to slavery as an existential threat to their privileged position. Traditional religious interpretations provide theological justification for slavery that makes opposition seem blasphemous rather than morally necessary. The caste system that places enslaved people at the bottom of social hierarchies receives reinforcement through daily interactions, marriage restrictions, and cultural practices that normalize human ownership. These structural elements operate independently of legal frameworks and government policies, making slavery resilient against superficial reform efforts. Economic incentives continue overwhelming moral and legal prohibitions because slavery remains extraordinarily profitable for owners who face virtually no risk of prosecution or financial penalties. Enslaved workers cost nothing beyond minimal food and shelter while generating substantial revenues through livestock care, agricultural production, domestic service, and mining operations. The economic value of unpaid labor has increased as new industries like gold mining and fishing create additional opportunities for exploitation. Climate change has made enslaved labor more valuable, rather than less so, because environmental challenges require more intensive work to maintain agricultural and pastoral operations. International commodity prices directly influence slavery intensity as owners increase exploitation when higher prices make enslaved labor more profitable. Political instability throughout neighboring countries has worsened Mauritania's slavery situation by creating refugee populations vulnerable to enslavement and reducing international attention to human rights issues. Mali's ongoing security crisis has displaced thousands of people who flee across borders seeking safety and become targets for slave owners seeking fresh labor. The collapse of government authority in parts of Mali and Niger has eliminated cross-border cooperation that might have monitored slavery practices or assisted escape attempts. Regional security concerns have shifted international focus away from human rights violations toward counterterrorism cooperation that benefits the Mauritanian government regardless of its slavery record. Multiple forms of discrimination intersect to make slavery particularly persistent because enslaved people face systematic exclusion based on race, ethnicity, class, and legal status simultaneously. The Harottan descendants of enslaved people experience ongoing discrimination that limits their economic opportunities and political participation even when they achieve legal freedom. Traditional ethnic hierarchies privilege Arab Berber groups over black African populations in ways that make slavery appear natural rather than criminal. Gender discrimination compounds other forms of exclusion for enslaved women who face sexual exploitation and forced breeding programs in addition to labor exploitation. These intersecting disadvantages create multiple barriers to freedom that operate even when individual forms of discrimination might be addressed. Previous anti-slavery efforts have failed because they focused on legal reforms and awareness campaigns rather than addressing the economic and social structures that make slavery profitable and culturally acceptable. International organizations have invested millions of dollars in programs that create impressive documentation and training materials while having zero impact on actual slavery practices. Government agencies established to combat slavery have become bureaucratic tools for managing international criticism rather than institutions committed to eliminating human bondage. Legal reforms have created the appearance of progress while including loopholes and enforcement gaps that ensure continued impunity for slave owners. Current trends suggest significant deterioration rather than improvement in slavery conditions because all the factors that drive human bondage are intensifying rather than diminishing. Climate change continues worsening environmental conditions that force vulnerable populations into desperate situations where slavery becomes their only survival option. Economic pressures from international markets are increasing rather than decreasing the profitability of enslaved labor in various industries. Population growth rates among enslaved communities exceed those of free populations, ensuring that absolute numbers of enslaved people will continue rising regardless of percentage improvements. Ending slavery in Mauritania would require fundamental transformation of economic structures, legal systems, and cultural attitudes that currently make human bondage profitable and socially acceptable among powerful elites. This transformation would need to include land redistribution, universal education access, comprehensive social services, and genuine political representation for formerly enslaved populations. Such changes would essentially require dismantling the entire social order that has existed for centuries and replacing it with democratic institutions committed to human equality and dignity. After decades of failed attempts and broken promises, the evidence points toward an uncomfortable conclusion about the true scope of this crisis. The mathematics of human bondage reveal a system operating with industrial efficiency across modern Mauritania. Conservative estimates place between 110,000 and 150,000 people in slavery today, representing an increase rather than decrease from previous years. Government officials deliver eloquent speeches about human dignity, while their security forces protect slave owners from prosecution. Courts dismiss cases on technical grounds, while enslaved families work the same land their ancestors worked for generations. International powers provide military cooperation and development aid while avoiding meaningful pressure for change. This crisis continues because it serves the economic interests of traditional elites who view enslaved people as essential business infrastructure rather than human beings deserving freedom. Until international consequences match the severity of these crimes, slavery will persist in Mauritania regardless of laws, speeches, or diplomatic promises.